centennial of the end of World War II. And we had a big parade and big doings downtown at the courthouse, all scheduled, and Mother Nature didn't cooperate with us, and consequently we had to cancel the ceremony and cancel the parade. We really didn't want to do it, but with the weather so bad that we really didn't have any other intelligent choice but to go ahead and cancel it. We're here at the beautiful historical Lane Place in Crawfordton, Indiana, and over the period of 1991 through today, which like I said is November 13th, 1995, we've been interviewing various veterans who were part of the fight in the big war, the World War II. And today we're going to be interviewing another one of these veterans of World War II. Now this whole idea of taping and talking to the veterans really was an idea that was brought forth by Bob Wernley, retired attorney here in Crawfordsville. And Bob had been watching some Civil War interviews way back, and he got to thinking, you know, if we don't get started on interviewing some of our World War II veterans, all of this history will be gone, and we won't have it for future generations. Now today, operating the camera is Mike Hall, Executive Director here at the beautiful Lane Place. He'll be doing that work. And so at this time, I'd like to get right into the interview. May I ask, sir, what's your name?
Charles Bunnell.
Yeah. Where do you live, Charlie?
I live north of Waytown on a farm.
I see. Well, when were you born?
I was born June the 24th, 1923, right the same area that I live in now.
That's coincidental. You're just 20 days younger than I am. Which is, I didn't know before, Charlie. By the way, I call you Charlie. Would that be the name that you prefer that I use?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Who were your parents?
Robert Newton and Winnie Florence Daisy Bunnell.
Your mother was a Daisy?
Yes,
I see. Now, did they live around Waytown?
Well, Wingate area was more their area, but at the present place that I live now, my folks moved there in 1919 and lived there until after my wife, Mary Margaret, and I were married. And then they moved north of Ellendale, and I moved or stayed where they were at until 1982, and we built a new home and just moved across the road. So just to move across the road is the only move I've ever made.
Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Well, none. I have a sister living, Fern Irvin. She lives in Wingate.
Mm-hmm.
I had a brother, Frank Bunnell, who is deceased. He passed away about 3 years ago. Then I had two other sisters, and they are both deceased, Frances and Florence.
Mm-hmm. Well, where did you start school when you were in kindergarten?
Well, they didn't have kindergarten at Waytown at that time.
First grade.
So I started at Waytown and went all 12 years at Waytown.
In other words, you graduated from Waytown in
1941.
1941. How many were in your class?
19.
Have you had any class reunions?
Yes. In fact, we just had our 50th one here 3 years ago. And I think of the 19, I think there's 15 or 16 of them still alive.
Is that right? Well, that's pretty good. That's a little higher number than I have in my class. I think there are about 40% of them gone.
Mm-hmm.
We have around 40 in our class, and I think there's 16 or 18 that are not with us anymore. Well, you got out of high school in 1941.
Mm-hmm.
Then what did you do, Charlie?
Well, I farmed. My dad, my parents were older when I was born. My father and mother were 44 years old when I was born. So I was the youngest child, and I felt like that I needed to help my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I got out of high school, I started farming with him. And I farmed with him until was on the farm until December of 1943. And that's when I went into the service.
Mm-hmm. What date did you go into service?
Well, I think I was inducted on the 16th. I think that was the date. I can't be sure today.
Why did you go into service?
Well, I felt like that it was my honor and duty to go into the service. I had stayed out a little bit longer than some of my friends on account of my father farming and the age he was. But I just wasn't comfortable with that, and I wanted to get in and do my part.
I know what you mean.
Now, when I said that I went in December, I joined the aviation cadets. Went to Indianapolis and took all the exams and passed the exams. But then it was almost 6 weeks after this before they called me and took me then.
You were, that was in Indianapolis?
Yes.
Okay. And then when you were finally called up, where did you go?
Fort Benjamin Harris, where I was inducted over there.
What'd you do there?
Well, I wasn't there but about 4 or 5 days. And they sent us on to Florida. Went to Miami Beach from there.
Mm-hmm.
A little interesting story that I might bring in here. When I went in at Fort Bend, I was one miserable person and didn't know anybody. And I just left my family at the gate. I was walking down through there, and I didn't have my billfold in my pocket very good, and it fell out of my pocket. And this fellow that was walking along behind me seen it fall out, and he grabbed it and run up and gave it to me. And we formed a friendship that day that is still going on.
Yes. And his name is?
Chet Steller.
Chet Steller.
And he's chairman, national chairman of the Veterans Rehabilitation Committee. Mm-hmm. Works out of Washington. Mm-hmm. Fine fellow.
Yes.
And we stayed friends all these years.
Yeah. Well, you were at Fort Bend for 5 days then. Where did you go?
Went to Miami Beach. Stayed in the hotels there, all right on the strip.
Well, that's pretty nice.
The government had taken them over. And this hotel I stayed in was called the Senator. And this hotel is still standing, but it's been taken over by the underprivileged down there. And we was there up until in the summer. And we took all of our basic training in a park, which is right close to there. And a lot of it then on the strip between the ocean and the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And that was quite an experience there.
Yeah. How many were in that class?
Well, I expect there was probably 150 in that class.
Mm-hmm. How long were you there?
Well, I was there until, I think about in April of that year.
That would be 44 then?
Yes.
April, okay.
Mm-hmm. And then, but in the meantime, right before we left there, they came through with an order and said that there wasn't going to be any more aviation cadets, that they were so short of gunners. The air war in Europe had taken its toll, and they transferred us out of the basic training air cadet there and sent us over to Fort Myers, Florida.
That would have been in April of 44, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And what did you do there?
Well, that's where I went through gunnery school. Took the rest of my air training there to be a gunner.
Had you flown any back where you were at Miami Beach?
No, we didn't fly any until we went to Fort Myers.
Then what did you fly in?
Well, we would fly in a B-17, and they'd take us out over the Gulf, and there would be smaller planes pulling a target, a tow target. And this is what we would practice with our 50 caliber guns shooting at this tow target.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting.
This was quite an experience there at Fort Myers. Of course, we lived in those fancy hotels there at Miami Beach, and we went from there to tents. And this air base that we was on at that time was right in the Everglades. And when we would take gunnery practice, they had built walks along this area back here, up above the water and the snakes, so that when you went back for gunnery school or gunnery practice, you had to shoot up over this water, see.
Mm-hmm.
And we really cleared that jungle down there with our 50 calibers.
I'll bet
With
you
just continuous shooting in there. And then another interesting thing, besides this sort of practice, we had some mesquite practice where they had a 1/4 mile track, and on this 1/4 mile track they had traps all around this area.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have to get down in those and load the traps. You took turns. And then you would ride a flatbed truck. And they'd go around there, and there was wires across the road, and the truck would trip those traps. And then you had a shotgun. And that was how you learned to follow and track. So once you got farther along, you would be able to know how to track an enemy plane.
Mm-hmm.
The ironic thing about all this was that there were so many snakes down there. And when you went down in there to load the traps, you always had to take a stick with you and shake the snakes out before you went down in there.
What kind of snakes were those?
Well, water moccasin, rattlesnakes.
They were all poisonous.
Oh, yes.
Did you have any of your buddies get dead?
No, because we was all too concerned about them. We never went in there until we were sure that the snakes were gone.
Well, that'd be scary. How long were you there then?
Well, I was there until almost the first part of September. And from there, they shipped us to Lincoln, Nebraska. And this is where our crew was formed, at Lincoln, Nebraska. And we had to take a lot of tests there. The high pressure altitude test. You went into this chamber, and it simulated, like say at 30,000 feet. And they tested you to see your hearing, your every kind of thing to see that you could stand this kind of pressure. Mm-hmm. Because back at gunnery school, all of our flying was just low-level flying, maybe 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet. We never had any high-altitude flying at all. Mm-hmm. So they had to be sure that you could stand the pressure, the high altitude.
And practice was in B-17s?
Yes.
I see.
Now, I might add that at Fort Myers, my training was to be a top turret gunner on a B-25. Of course, they had all kinds of simulation turrets. But this is what my training was. A top turret on a B-25, you sat on a pedestal, and it was just like a bicycle seat. And this is what you sat on. And this seat would turn as your turret turned. And this is what I had trained for. Mm-hmm. But after what they done, when you got out to Lincoln, they had all the gunners together, they had all the pilots and the co-pilots, and from there, they would put a crew together. You had a 10-man crew. You had a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, and a bombardier, and then you had 6 gunners. And 2 of these gunners, one of them was the flight engineer, and the other was a radio operator. But then the other 4 was just strictly, they didn't have any other job but to be a gunner.
What were you?
I was a tail gunner.
You were the tail gunner?
I was the tail gunner. And I might add that while we was at Lincoln and we was put on this crew, they just came to me one day and they said, now you've had your training for this top turret gunner on a B-25, but you're going to be a tail gunner on a B-24. I had no knowledge whatsoever of the tail turret on a B-24. But this, you might as well know, this is the way the government operated.
I know.
So this is how I became a tail gunner on a B-24.
Well, let me see. If I can remember, Charlie, were you pretty well on the back of the plane then? On the tail, did you pretty well stick out?
Yes. Clear out behind.
Can I use the term? You were kind of a sitting duck there then?
That's right.
Did you feel like a sitting duck?
Yes, definitely you did.
Could you see all directions?
Well, you could see a good 180 degrees from from one, you could swing the turret almost from one side around to the other side.
And what was your ammunition? What was your...
I had 250 caliber machine guns.
Mounted together?
Yes, well, they were
twins?
Yes, twin 50s. And you had your ammunition fed from both sides. You had two ammunition boxes, and you threaded your ammunition into those from both sides. And then we also had extra ammunition we carried right behind. I might add, on this tail turret, it was small. It was hard to get into. And it had doors on it that you could reach in behind you and pull those doors shut. But one of the first things that my instructor told me, he says, you may not want to use these doors because he said at high altitude, sometimes they'll freeze shut. And if you would have to bail out, they wouldn't open. So as soon as we got into practice, I never used my doors. And when you would turn your turret clear to one side, then you would get air from the propellers and the slipstream.
Oh, you would?
Yes. And at 30,000 feet, it was cold.
Was it rough riding?
Beg pardon?
Was it bumpy? Rough?
Well, that all depends on the weather. I mean, whether it would be rough or not.
Mm-hmm. Did you know what was going on, for example, up in the cockpit? Did you have earphones on to know? Yes, we were discussing about communications on a B-24 with Charlie Bunnell. We had a momentary loss of picture here and recording to change some batteries in our recording video camera. So Charlie, can we come back here now, and how did you keep in communications with the cockpit?
We had everyone had an earphone. You had a system on your plane, and you would plug your headset into this system, and you could communicate with the pilot or other members of the crew. But mainly, the communication you had with the pilot was if you were flying at high altitudes, and you were on oxygen. You had to have an oxygen check approximately every 2 minutes in case your oxygen mask would freeze up. Then they would know, and if you didn't answer, when he would call for each person to acknowledge his check, well, then someone would come and check on you.
Mm-hmm. Now, this was at Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yes.
And from there you went to?
Casper, Wyoming.
All right.
And Casper, Wyoming was the final training base for overseas training. And we got to Casper roughly sometime the 1st of September. I don't know the exact date.
1944.
Yes, And we arrived at Casper on a train. And I'll never forget that because Casper itself is kind of on a plain, but then you have Casper Mountain, which is real close to this. And we came in there, and there was all these crews that were assigned at Lincoln, Nebraska. All of us went to Casper. And I think there was probably roughly 20 crews that went in there. And we were issued flying clothes and everything that was necessary to start our training. And the first few days was more or less orientation. We would go up on short flights and learn the countryside. We had to know where the bombing range was at, where the gunnery range was at. Mm-hmm. And then after what you had there, Claire, it was just like all the other Army goose-ups. You had one plane for 3 crews. In other words, one crew would have the plane supposedly for 6 or 7 hours. Then the next crew would take the plane. Well, nobody ever got through on time, and it was always hurry up and wait. And we spent the whole 3 months there hurrying up and waiting. But this was really an extensive training course. And they worked us hard. We would fly, we learned to fly in formation, we learned to drop bombs, we learned all the techniques of gunnery. And I might add that I told you earlier that they just walked in one day and said, "You're going to be a gunner on a B-24." Well, when we got to Casper and we got into our training, and they had simulated gun turns. And I went down one day, and this sergeant come up to me, and he said, "Now, the only training you're going to get on this turn is how to operate it today." And those twin 50s was fastened together with a yoke. And this was run by hydraulic. And when you elevated those guns, that yoke came back. And if you didn't, what he told me that day, and I'll never forget it, he said, "Now, when you get out of that turret, you be sure your guns are down and you turn the hydraulic valve off." Because he said, if you reach in there and grab those gun handles, and the guy before you didn't turn that hydraulic valve off, he says those guns will come back, and he says that yoke can break your neck. Well, I don't know whether that would happen or not, but he made a believer out of it.
I would think you would.
And that was all the training I needed, because from that day on, whenever I would come out of that turret, I'd be sure the guns was down, the valve was turned on. Abilene, Texas was one of the most bombed cities in World War II. That's where all of our training flies. We flew from Casper to Abilene and simulated bombing. And my job was to take films of this. And what you'd done, I mean, it was all done through the bomb site. And when the bombardier would say bombs away, then I would take a picture immediately. And they could tell from that picture that I took whether he was dropping his bombs on the target or not. And we done daylight bombing down there. We done night bombing. Then we had a regular bombing range out there where we could drop live bombs. Now, they didn't have much explosive in them, but enough, to tell whether you were hitting the target or not. And then close to the Grand Tetons in the Jackson Hole country was where our gunnery range was at. And we would fly over there, and the gunners then would practice shooting their guns.
What did you shoot at?
Well, they had targets set up. But I got to tell you, we got in trouble one day. We shot some sheep. And this didn't go over very good. But
on purpose?
Well, you didn't have to ask me that. We got in trouble over it, but we was close to going overseas that they kind of dropped it because they needed us. But you know how young men are.
Yes.
That was just a challenge. And you see those sheep down there, and that was a moving target. So we thought, well, we'll just try it out.
Yeah.
But the sad part of our training at Casper, Wyoming, was the men that we lost in training. Now, we were flying in planes that had lots of hours on them. And a friend that I had developed a close friendship, his name was Cecil Ferguson. And that's the first friend that I lost in the service.
Well, how did he lose his life?
Well, they was coming in, and the plane just lost power, and as it was going down, they hit a power line, and the plane burnt and exploded.
Okay.
And I might add that, believe it or not, in 3 months training at Casper, Wyoming, we lost 10 planes. We lost more planes at Casper than we did after I went overseas.
At what point, Charlie, and you being a tail gunner, did you get training in recognition of enemy planes?
Well, of course, these were classes that they had. We had to be able to go to school, or had to go to school, and recognize all kinds of enemy planes. That was
Where was that at?
That was at Casper.
At Casper.
Uh-huh.
That was in a classroom.
Yes.
How'd they do that?
Well, it would just be a big room, and they would have these planes on a screen, and they would flash by. Maybe they would be coming at you head on. Maybe it was a side shot, or maybe it was a rear end shot. But you had to be quick, which in combat it was going to be the same way. It was going to have to be quick.
What? And didn't they show you friendly planes too? So
Oh yes, we had to be able to identify any plane that they thought we would come in contact with.
Did they give you a test?
Oh yes, they most certainly did.
Yeah.
Another thing two things that I want to bring out here was a 50 caliber machine gun. We had to be able to take that machine gun apart and put it back together blindfolded. Plus, the instructor sometimes would take out a piece, or he would put a broken piece in. And we had to be able to do this. That was another test. And you had to pass that test before you ever put your wings. And that was a strict test. I think there's approximately a little less than 100 pieces when you could strip that 50 caliber completely down. And the idea behind this, Claire, would be in case you had trouble with that gun on a mission, you had to be able to work on it in the dark. And you didn't fool around when you was working with that, because you wanted to know how to do that.
Did you have parachute?
Oh yes,
Strapped on you?
Well, you couldn't have it strapped on the tail turret. You had to leave your parachute behind you. And on a B-24, there's right behind the tail turret, there is a small door that the tail gunner can bail out of that door. Now the rest of the people could wear their chutes, but the tail gunner and the belly gunner couldn't wear his chute either.
Let me see. Now there was the tail gunner, and then there was the belly gunner.
Yes.
And then a turret.
A top turret.
A top turret.
You had two side turrets.
Two sides.
Two sides, and then you had one on the front, your nose turret. Now your bombardier also handled that nose turret.
Oh, he did? I see. And those were all 50 gallon
Yes, all of
machine
them.
guns. Well, you're still at Casper, and you've made several raids over Abilene.
Yes.
And then what happened?
Well, I'm not done with the schooling yet.
Okay.
They knew that we were going to go into a night outfit. We didn't know it, but I guess they did. So we went to school to learn how to see in the dark. And believe it or not, there is a lot to learn. There is a lot of helps that you can learn to use that will help you to see in the dark. And they even had a bowling alley set up. And the pins and the bowling ball were fluorescent, and that was the only light in that room. And we learned to bowl in the dark. Now, I know
Interesting.
this sounds funny, but that was part of our night training.
Isn't that something?
And of course, they taught us to never look direct at an object. Always look out of the side of your eye, and it really helps your night vision. And that's something that's carried through with me even today. If I'm out of a night, and especially if you think there's a light or something that will affect your eyesight, if you'll more or less look out of the corner of your eye, that doesn't affect your vision.
That's interesting.
And that's something that has carried with me through all these years. Plus, we had a special goggle. It was red. And you wore these too. The flash of lights wouldn't affect your sight.
I see.
So all of this took part of our training then at Casper, Wyoming. Our crew became a family. And when I say family, we was just as close as brothers, because you had to work together. Everybody's life depended on the other.
What was your group called? Do you have a number
Well,
or a name?
no, just Ed Cantor was our pilot, and we was Cantor's crew.
Where was he from?
He was from Boston, Massachusetts, and the co-pilot was too. But the rest of the fellows was scattered clear across the United States.
Yeah. Would your pilot have been a major?
No, he was just a second lieutenant when we was captured.
Really? Well, they needed pilots bad then.
And our co-pilot was, at that time, was flight officer.
Is that right?
Mhm. He didn't become a second lieutenant until we got overseas.
I see.
And we were still PFCs until we finished there at Casper. And then we were made a corporal when we was ready to leave Casper. But by the time we left Casper, it was about the middle of December. We were a good crew. We had worked hard, and our performance tests, all of them, were good. So we knew that we had done a good job while we were there.
So you left Casper then in the middle of December?
Yes.
And then where'd you go?
Went to Topeka, Kansas.
What'd you do there?
Well, that's where they got you ready to go overseas. You took all your final briefings there. We had all of our shots before we went overseas. Had an interesting thing to happen while I was at Topeka, Kansas. There was a fellow that from Crawfordsville. His name was Pete Westfall, and I had never knew Pete, but he was on a different crew. But we met then while we was there at Topeka. And his wife-to-be came out there, and they wanted me to stand up with them. And I did. And I had not seen Pete Westfall until September the 2nd of this year. And when I received, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I wanted to bring this in. When I received a Purple Heart, he seen it on Channel 6 television, and he told his wife, he said, now that's the guy that stood up with us, and I'm going to go to Crawfordsville Saturday and see him.
That's interesting.
And we had quite a reunion that day.
You know, that would be something. Yeah.
So,
Is his wife still living?
yes, and they live in Plainfield, Indiana, and run an antique shop.
Yeah, that's not too far from here.
But we had a wonderful reunion that day.
Oh, that sounds
But
great.
anyway, we were just there a few days, and we left there, got on a train, and went to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. And we were there just, a short time, and put us on the Queen Elizabeth. Now, some of the crews flew a plane over, but some of them went over by a ship. And there was 100 Air Force men, 10 crews, went over the same time that I did. And we all went over on Queen Elizabeth. There was 17,000 boys on that Queen Elizabeth. Now you think about that, 17,000, which a ship probably made to carry maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people. Now the Air Force men were lucky. They put us up on the promenade deck, and we had cabins. But a lot of those men from the infantry and artillery laid out on that open deck in December. And you can imagine how cold it would be in December. That was quite an experience to go over on that ship. With that many men, the feeding was just fantastic. We ate twice a day. You got in line at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you might wait 3 hours before they ever got to you. Mm-hmm. And you just ate twice a day, because the time they'd get through the first go-around, it was time to start back again.
Did your whole group was together? Your 10 men?
Yes.
You were all
Well,
together?
no, let's back up there. The officers didn't. We were together in a sense, but the enlisted...
How did the officers get there?
No, they were on the ship.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
But we weren't in the same rooms.
Right, they wouldn't be.
Yeah.
That's true. How many days take you to go across?
It took us 3 days and 4 nights. And we zigzagged the whole time. We didn't have any escort. Of course, the Queen Elizabeth at that time was faster than the submarines that the Germans had. And this is why we zigzagged the whole time. But when we were about mid-Atlantic, we had the British radio on, and the Germans had announced that they had sunk the Queen Elizabeth in mid-Atlantic with a loss of 17,000 men. Well, you know how that would make you feel, because they knew where you was at.
Yeah.
They knew how many men was on the ship. But really, it didn't concern us too much because of the speed of the Queen Elizabeth, that we felt like that we were safe.
Did you see any enemy vessels?
No, we didn't see any at all.
Did they have any type of drills?
Oh, yes.
What did you do?
Well, we had to had to know where all the lifeboats were at.
Okay.
Plus, every day, the gun crews on that ship practiced. But all of us laughed and we said we hoped we didn't get attacked by air, no better shots than they were.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't do a very good shot.
You saw no signs of the enemy in the sky or in the water?
Not at all.
Okay. Go ahead.
We landed in the Firth of Clyde. See, the Queen Elizabeth was so big that they couldn't at that time dock at a regular dock with all these army men. And we landed in the Firth of Clyde, which is right off the coast of Scotland. And all this material and all these men were unloaded on barges. They took 100 people from the whole ship to help unload this material, put it on barge, and we went up the Clyde River, which was about a 30-mile journey. And I don't know whether I was fortunate or unfortunate, but I was one of the ones that was picked for this detail. And it was a dirty detail. It was hard work. But anyway, we went up the Clyde River, and that's one of the highlights of my life, is riding that barge up that Clyde River. Oh, it was so beautiful, even in December. And I can remember the Clydesdale's horses out in the fields as we went up that Clyde River. The barges then landed at Glasgow, Scotland. And the building that we come up to was the largest building that I ever seen. Well, then we had to jump in and unload all this material off of these barges and put it in this building. And then it all had to be sorted into where each outfit was going to go. And on Christmas Day of 1944, probably I worked the hardest I ever did in my life. We didn't get any time off or anything because they were needing all this material. Then after we got it sorted into where it's supposed to go, then we had to load all this on the boxcars. And that was quite an experience. Well, the rest of my crew then had gone on to the base where they was going to go. And after we did get this stuff loaded and it was shipped out, they gave us about 2 or 3 days up there and let us tour Glasgow. We went to the University of Glasgow, Scotland there. Mm-hmm. Really got to enjoy that. Mm-hmm. Then on the New Year's Day, they put us on a train and we went down to our base, which was about 40 miles north of London. And that's where I joined my crew then. And this was on New Year's Day. So I'd been away from them for approximately a week on this detail that I was on.
And that's where you picked up your plane?
Yes.
Was it a new plane?
No. It was a plane that had been crew before us that had finished their tour, had used this plane. Now the base that I was on was called Cheddington Air Base. It was approximately 40 miles north of London. And at that time, England was just covered with airfields. Just, where you looked, there was airfields.
Right.
And when we first got our orientation there, it took you 2 or 3 times to really learn which airfield was yours and which landing strip that you were supposed to be in. And it wasn't nothing uncommon for green pilots to land at the wrong airfield.
Well, they do that sometimes here in the United States.
Yes, I know that.
That has happened.
That's right.
Okay. Now this is 40 miles north of London. Was it all bombers there? All B-24s?
Yes.
Were there any fighter planes around?
No, but we had one B-17, and our commanding officer wouldn't fly a B-24, and he flew a B-17. This really didn't go over too good with everybody else.
Why?
Well, a B-17 was considered a safer plane. I won't say it was a better plane, but it was considered a safer plane. Plus, the way it was built, the radio room on a B-17 had heat in it. And there was some place you could get warm on a B-17, but on a B-24 there wasn't. But, you know, you felt like that if your commanding officer should have flown the same plane that you were flying.
I would think so. Right.
But this wasn't the case. Now, I'd like to start right here. Our whole operation was a different operation. We were called the carpetbaggers. It was a covert operation, and it was run by the OSS.
I see.
We were listed as 8th Air Force, but actually we were under the operation, and we were under the direction of the OSS. And as I say, we were called the carpetbaggers. And I think, you know, when you think of a carpetbagger, he's someone that he does different things. And this is what this group done. It was so secretive that the people, the English people around this area, didn't know what went on at this airbase.
Where'd they get their orders from? Washington?
Well,
Directly?
I suppose that I couldn't say because there was so much about this airfield, and I'll get into this a little later on in our interview as some of the things that came out in later years about this.
Okay.
But immediately after we got there, then we started orientation. Of course, then we had they had gunnery ranges there that you had to practice gunnery. They had the schools, like I said, and identification of fighter planes and German bombers and this sort of thing. You had to know what to do in case of an air drill. All this was drilled into you. Then for probably 2 or 3 weeks, you had all kinds of orientation flights to get you used to the countryside, to know where your airfield was at. Then just from there, we just kept working into closer to the time that we would start flying missions. But we really became a strong family once we got overseas. And you worked together. Now, all the enlisted men had their own barracks. The officers had their own barracks. And we had... the only way that you had to get around over there was by bicycles. And whenever somebody would leave over there, he'd sell his bicycle to another crew that came in. And all of our crew had a bicycle. And that's the way we got around.
That's interesting.
Our mess hall was quite a ways from where we lived, so we would ride our bicycles to the mess hall. We had... when you got through eating, you had a couple horse tanks out there with water in them and soap, and you dipped your mess kits down in them, rinsed them off, and tied them onto your bicycle and took off. And that's kind of the way we done.
Did you have decent food there?
Yes. That's one thing about the Air Force. They had good food, and then when you were flying, we had excellent food.
How long, I don't want you to leave anything out now, but what else did you do before you took your first mission? Is there anything else special, Charlie?
Well, just
Training.
It was just training, and we got, in that period of time, we had 2 leaves. One of them, weekend passed, we went to London. And then just a few days before we started flying, we went down to Brighton Beach, which is a resort town, right down on the English Channel. And there wasn't any troops stationed there. And it was more like a place that you could just go there and relax.
I see. Okay, about what date are we talking about here now?
Well,
For example, what was the date of your first mission?
our date of our first mission was, it was just the very last of February. It's when we made our first mission. In other words, we was there 2 months, just training, before we started flying.
Okay. Well, tell us about the first mission.
Well, the first mission was more or less a milk run, as they called it over there. We went over Holland. There really wasn't much excitement going on that night. We just...
It was at night.
Yeah, I flew all together at night. Our bombers were painted black, coal black. We flew at night. We flew by ourselves. We didn't have any fighter escort or anything. It was all just, you depended on the darkness for your protection. So this carpetbaggers, they just done everything. But mainly, what my outfit done was drop leaflets over occupied territory, informing the people the progress of the war, what was taking place, what was going to take place. These leaflets were packed in a canister that looked just like a bomb. And you would load those in the bomb rack, and when you fly over enemy territory, wherever they wanted these released, why, you would drop these, and you had a barometric fuse on those canisters. And say at 5,000 feet, those canisters would burst and just spread them leaflets for miles. And of course, Holland was still occupied territory at that time. So, but there wasn't too much anti-aircraft fire there, and there wasn't too many fighters. So your first mission, they wanted you to more or less get oriented as to what was going to take place. What we would do, flying at night, you would, about noon, you would go down to the briefing room and to see if he was going to fly. And if he was going to fly, your name was listed on a board. And then about 3 o'clock, you would go down to briefing. And they would tell you then where your mission was going to be, and what time you would leave, what kind of weather you was going to expect. Then after we finished briefing, then we would go and eat. And as I say, especially when you were flying, the food was good. And then from there, then you went back and you picked up your flight gear, and you picked up your parachutes. Then when you went into this room where all the crews was at, well then your officer would give your final instructions, and you was given a packet that had money in it, had escape. In other words, if you had to bail out, your escape route, the money for the country that you was going to be over, and this sort of thing. You didn't take any valuables with you at all.
A wristwatch?
Well, I took a wristwatch, but I mean as far as your billfold or this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But every one of us had a .45 caliber revolver. And but outside of that, you didn't take any identification with you. But you did have this package that you took.
You say no identification, you did not wear your dog tags?
Yes, that everybody had to have your dog tag.
I thought.
But what I meant identification, you know, like in your billfold pictures, your family or anything that,
Sure.
in case you did get captured, things that couldn't be used otherwise.
Right.
Yeah, you had to have your dog tags.
Yeah, I thought you did.
Yes, that was kind of a misconception there.
But that was the milk run. How long did it last?
Well, I would say probably 3 hours. And everything just went great on that.
Did you see any enemy planes?
No, not that night. We didn't.
Not that night.
It was just that nice, simple mission.
Okay.
And then we came back, and when you'd get back, then you'd have to go to the briefing room, be debriefed, and they'd ask you if you've seen any planes or if you've seen any unusual activity on the ground. And then from there, well, then you were fed again. Of course, by that time it would be say midnight, 1 o'clock, and then from there, then you went back to your barracks. See, the night crews their hours was altogether different.
Uh-huh.
And then maybe you would wait 2 or 3 days then before you would fly again.
Did you fly again in 3 days?
Yes. And then,
Tell us about that.
well, then each mission got to be a little deeper into Germany. The second mission we made, and I can't tell you for sure the town we was over, but
Was it a German town?
yes, but I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, we had an 80-mile-an-hour headwind that night, and our speed was approximately 160 miles an hour. Well, our navigator got mixed up, and he took us over the target the first time against that wind. So, see, actually, we'd only been running 80 miles an hour. But anyway, the bombardier couldn't get his sights, we didn't release the bombs then. And we made 3 hitches over that town that night. And the third time, we was all getting pretty shook up because they knew we were there and the flak was coming up. But we were fortunate enough that we got out of that.
Now this was a bombing raid over a German town. Would it have been, was it a large city?
No, it was a smaller setting.
I just wondered if it was Ludwigshafen or Mannheim or any of those towns. They were pretty heavily bombed by us at night. That doesn't ring a bell with you?
No, I'm sorry, I can't tell you the name. I didn't get home with much, and a lot of information that I had was lost because, as we'll find out later.
Yeah, we'll wait on that.
Now, this same night, though, we had an experience. Our bomb bay doors wouldn't shut, whether they froze open or not. So the English had been so well trained that if a plane came in with bomb bay doors open, that meant one thing: they were going to drop bombs. So when you flew at night and you came back in over England, you had to come in at a certain time, at a certain place, at a certain altitude. And if you couldn't meet this criteria, you had to break radio silence and call Air Sea Rescue. And Air Sea Rescue then would take your plane over and chart you a whole new course, and you had to follow this direction. And as we came in that night, when we got within approximately, I'd say, 3 miles of the coast of England, the guy told, he said, now you make a 360. And we made a 360 circling out over the English Channel. And they turned every searchlight on you they had, I think. It was just as light as it is in this room here. But they couldn't take any chances. They had to be sure you was a friendly plane. Well, once then that we made the circle and come back in, then they let us come back in. and we were able to go on into our base and land. But that was our first experience that we had with the English and how careful they was as far as letting planes in.
Okay.
Then this was getting up in March then.
1945.
Yes, and we had flown 6 missions and really hadn't had too many problems. Just the major problems or minor problems that you would run into on a mission. Maybe you'd have a little engine problem, or maybe you'd have a little problem with your oxygen. Maybe you'd have a little trouble getting your bombs out. But we had really had real good luck. And then on our 7th mission, we had gone to Cologne. And things went real well going in. But we had just dropped our bombs and had just got away from Cologne when they started hitting us with anti-aircraft fire. Just flak and anti-aircraft fire, just as every place you could see. But we were still fortunate that we were high enough that we could evade this. But we knew that they had our altitude, they just didn't quite have our speed. And we finally worked out of this and had a day more and worked out of that till a German fighter plane picked us up. We had simple radar at that time. And on our plane, we had a box that had 2 lights on it. One of them was yellow and one of them was red. And if a German fighter was trying to play around with you out there and try to pick you up, a yellow light would come on, letting us know that he was out there. Of course, as I say, this was dark, this was night. We by ourselves. So we was relying on the darkness and on the speed to evade him, but after a bit, the red light came on, and we knew that he had attached to us. And we all talked it over what we should do, whether if there was any shooting to do, it was going to be me that had to shoot. Well, I couldn't see him. If I missed him, he definitely would see our fire, see. So our pilot decided to take evasive action and try to break radar contact, and which he did. But
I don't know what you mean by break radar contact.
Well, you've got a beam, see,
Yeah.
and as long as that he was following us, and this beam, then he could just pull right up to us, see.
Right.
But if you could dive quick enough and get out of that radar.
All right. Okay.
So our pilot put the plane in this dive, and I think he didn't realize he was in as steep a dive as he was. We did break radar contact with the fighter plane, but then when he pulled the plane out of this dive, he come up too quick, and the plane it just sounded like you would take a pin and burst a balloon. The rivets popped in the plane. He stressed the wings. He stressed the tail. Well, we finally got it out of the dive and got leveled off, and we was down about 10,000 feet then. And the plane was shaking so bad that I couldn't even set the tail. And there we was lost over enemy territory. And before the navigator could get his bearings as to where we was at, we ended up over Dusseldorf, Germany, at the same time the English were bombing it. And here we were flying at 10,000 feet, and they were dropping bombs at 25,000 feet.
My goodness.
And we was flying through that. Well, the good Lord was with us that night. And we got through that and got to where we could break radio silence again. And then that night, then we had to call air-sea rescue. And we had quite a time of getting back because the plane was so heavily damaged from the anti-aircraft fire, the evading the fighter, and everything. So we couldn't maintain altitude or anything. So on this last mission, that's when we contacted Air Sea Rescue and got us back in. And we were able to land the plane, although it was in very bad shape.
You, were you in the, did you get out of the tail turret?
Oh yes.
You had to.
I
couldn't have rode it out.
It just,
Yeah.
I might add, we discussed bailing out. But it's like all of us voted that as long as the plane was flying, we felt as long as if we could just get out of enemy territory, that we were better off.
Were the engines both working? There were two engines, or four?
Now, for it. At that time, the engines were all working.
They were working.
But the plane was just so badly damaged that you couldn't control it hardly to fly in it.
When you came in, did you have a pretty rough landing?
Yes. We took out several landing lights, but we were able to make it down.
I see. Did anybody get hurt?
No, not then.
Okay.
But let's take a break.
All right, let's take a break.
Okay.
We're back now with Charlie Bunnell talking about his experiences in World War II. And Charlie, I believe that we were at the point where you had just had a bad experience coming back from having bombed Cologne and all the troubles you ran into on the way back, and you just landed back at your home base. Now, you want to take us from there? And,
Yes.
And why don't you go ahead, if you can, Charlie, and just tell us the sequence of events then that happened that led to the tragedy that happened after that.
Okay, the next day, we were ordered to fly this airplane. Now, there's been a lot of talk and maybe a lot of controversy of why we was sent up in this plane. But that's neither here nor there. That's something that had happened 50 years ago. There was a lot of things that went on in the war that you didn't question. We were young men. As I say, there was a war on. They ordered the plane up. We took the plane up. The first hint that we had that we might be in trouble was we had trouble getting the engine started. But once we got the engine started, took off down the runway, I thought everything was going to be all right. And we got up 500 feet, and just all at once the pilot said, "The controls are locked." Well, there we were 500 feet. The controls were locked on this plane. We couldn't go up or we couldn't go down. The pilot, the co-pilot, the engineer, they were all working, trying to find out what our problem was. But the longer it happened, the more we realized we were in trouble. And about this time, our number 3 engine caught on fire. A number 3 engine on this plane controlled the hydraulics. And then we knew we were in serious trouble. I had seen several B-24s crash, and every time they crashed, they burned, they exploded, they killed all 10 men. So there, you're sitting in this airplane. You couldn't go up or you couldn't go down. The engine was on fire, and you had to wait it out. And you thought, well, I've been lucky so far, but maybe my luck's run out. So we started throwing stuff out of the plane. Anything that would come loose, we threw out of that plane, but we still couldn't get any altitude out of it. But I'll have to say that I've never been around a more calmer bunch of men in my life. All of us were trained, we were professionals. We knew every time we took a plane up that what our odds was. So this went on for about 20 minutes. I lived a lifetime. I just can't tell you some of the experiences or what we went through with in that period of time. But anyway, this one airfield, England was covered with air bases, and this air base came within sight, and the pilot thought maybe that we can do something and cut power and get this plane down on the grass of this runway. And he attempted to put the landing gear down, which was a mistake, which I understood in that time. We all make mistakes, but with no hydraulics, only one of them came down. And as this plane dropped in, there was a construction shack there. And we hit this construction shack, and they had a bunch of oil drums stacked here. And we plowed through them, and by this one landing gear being down, the minute the plane hit, it cartwheeled. And we just rolled over and tumbled all across this strip. And all the time this plane was breaking up. But the second this plane stopped, then it exploded and burst into flames. But the explosion was the best thing that ever happened to it, because it blew us all away from the flames. There wasn't a one of us that was burned. Ironically, 3 men of this 10-man crew walked away from that plane and never had a scratch on them. I was thrown away from the fire, and by that time there was fire equipment there, and the navigator on the plane and I were put on the same ambulance, and we were taken into a little field hospital, which they had no, as far as operating or anything, they couldn't do that there. And they more or less splintered us up and done the best they could. And the navigator and I was sent on to a general hospital. It was the 303rd General Hospital. And he died immediately after we got to this hospital. Still hard to talk about, even though it happened 50 years ago.
Sure it is.
But I went into this hospital, and they examined me, and they told me that now we're going to take your arm off at the elbow. And I said, no, you're not going to take it off. I said, I've got the rest of my life before me, and we're not going to do this. So they said, okay, we won't do that today. And they x-rayed me, and I was just broken up all over and set what bones and things they could. And they said, we'll wait. So every day they'd come in, they say, well, we're going to have to do it. I said, no, we're not going to have to do it. And this went on for about 3 weeks, and we had a couple young surgeons that was fantastic. And they came in and they said, well, since you're so determined to keep this arm, we've come up with an idea that we think that we can go in there with plates and screws and take what bone you have left and rebuild this arm. And I said, well, let's give it a try. We don't have anything to lose. And this was along about the middle of April. Of course, I lost all track of time then. But they had this operation, and after the operation, they put me in a body cast. And this arm here was up like this. The shoulder had been broken, and they had to repair this. My ankle was broken, my knee was tore up, this hand was tore up. But they just done fabulous work. It was unreal what they done for me. And on Mother's Day of 1945, they sent me home. I come home from Prestwood, Scotland. I landed at Mitchell Field, New York. On the way home, we stopped at Iceland and Newfoundland, and then flew on to Mitchell Field. And from there, I came to Nichols General Hospital in Kentucky. And then from there, I went to the St. Thomas. It was a hospital right out of Cincinnati. And I was there until up in about August or September. Then I was sent to Cryle Cleveland Hospital and had plastic surgery on my right hand. And I was discharged from there in November the 16th of 1945. Had wonderful treatment. I can't say enough for the treatment that I had received.
Now, a couple of other questions, Charlie, if you can answer them. You talked about you lost your navigator. What happened? And you said 3 walked away. Did anyone else lose their life or get hurt that way?
There was one other fellow that was hurt about like I was, and his name's Reuben Hill, and he lives in Minnesota. We're still good friends. We visit back and forth. The rest of them had injuries, but nothing like Hill's and I's.
I see. The main thing then was your arms were hurt.
Yes.
Especially the left one. And it was the bone was shattered so bad,
Yes,
why they wanted to take the bone off.
Yes.
And then your right hand was hurt.
My right hand.
And your ankle was broken.
Yeah. And my knee.
And your knee. How about your back?
Well, I had a hole punched in my back, and in later years I had to have back surgery for that, but not at that time.
Neck, face?
No. I had cuts, and I've just got scars all over from cuts and bruises.
What did you hit then? Do you remember the impact?
Well, the explosion, Claire, is what done most of my damage. The plane exploding and blowing me free of the plane.
Do you remember that though?
Yes.
Were you
I was never unconscious.
Not unconscious.
I can, to this day, I can sit here and I can see the bottom of that plane being tore up as we hit the first time. But I was holding on to some bars up above, and I held on to them till we hit again, and that's when it exploded and burned.
Like you say, the explosion saved you, didn't it?
Yes, it
because
did.
the plane completely burned.
Yes, oh, there wasn't nothing.
But everybody was out.
Yes. Was the miracle. It was a miracle. Because I said, in my time of service, I seen 10 B-24s crash and burn and get all 10 men.
How'd it throw you out if you had your seatbelts fast?
Well, you didn't have seatbelts then.
You didn't have any safety belt or
No.
anything in the plane? Okay. Well, that answers one of my questions.
We were just in the tail section or the belly section of the plane and just holding on to whatever we could hold on to.
Were there ever any investigations after that, Charlie?
You know, Claire, if there was, I don't know about.
Well, it's probably just, well, you don't.
Yes.
Right.
I just know that the crew chief on our plane just was crushed over it. And he came to visit me in the hospital. And some of the pictures that I have, that's how I got them. They were classified pictures, but somehow he got a hold of them and he gave them to me. And that's how I got home with some of these pictures of this plane crash.
Well, you're back in the United States and you're at Cleveland, and you get discharged from Cleveland. By the way, at the time of your crash, were your parents alerted?
Yes, they were. I mean, they just was notified that I had been wounded in action. That's all it said.
Mm-hmm.
And then in a few days, the chaplain wrote them a letter.
Mm-hmm.
But until I was able to write myself, that's about all they knew, that I had been wounded. And they didn't know to what extent. But it was about a month before I was able to, even write to them or let them know.
Then in November of 1945, you were discharged.
Yes.
And you came back to Wingtown.
Mm-hmm.
And you came back to do what then?
To farm.
To farm.
That's all I ever wanted to do, was to farm.
That's good. That's a good profession, I know.
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
And then in February the 22nd, 1947, I married Mary Margaret Miller from New Ross. And we took up housekeeping where my folks had always lived. They built a new home and we went to housekeeping there. And then we had two sons, Timothy, who is a pharmacist at Covington, and Michael, who's an engineer for Case International, lives in Clarendon Hill, Illinois. Timothy has two boys, Shane and Bryce, and Mike has two girls, Jackie and Natalie. So we have 4 grandchildren.
That's great. That's great. Do you ever have a reunion of your crew?
Yes, we had a reunion back in 1988. And this is what got me started thinking about the Purple Heart. Because this Reuben Hill that I told you that was seriously hurt, just like I was, told that he had received the Purple Heart. That he was sent to a hospital in Denver, and he was awarded the Purple Heart while he was in this hospital. So, in about 1989, I thought, well, I've lived all these years without it, but if I deserve it, I'm going to try to get it. So, I went to St. Louis and got my records. I was one of the fortunate ones, you know, most of the records burned up in St. Louis at that
Right.
time. But I got them, and also they wrote to the Veterans Administration and got all of my records from out of the hospital and everything. So this is where I started. I started with my congressman first. Didn't have much luck with him. And then about that time, Lauren Rutledge got to be county service officer. And we went to work on it. And I really and truly believe that because of the secret outfit that I was in was why it was so hard to get records and why it was so hard for me to get this information. They just acted as though we never existed. They just more or less wanted to forget about us. But through the efforts of Lauren and through the efforts of Senator Lugar's office in Indianapolis, they approved it. Finally it went to the Military Board of Corrections, and within 5 days after the Military Board of Corrections got a hold of it, they wrote me and informed me that they were going to be awarded the Purple Heart.
That's great. That's just great. Do you have your Purple Heart with you?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, well, maybe we can take a look at it and tell us a little bit about how it was awarded to you and when, Charlie.
I might add, you want to hold this just a minute, Claire?
Okay. I'm going to hold that up there to the camera. Can you pick that up?
The Purple Heart was originated by George Washington back in 1782 was the first time. And then at that time it was the highest military decoration that there was. But for some reason it was discontinued for a period of time, and then it was picked back up again. And it was, and as this says here, is who it's given to and why it was given to me and on the date that I was wounded. And then on this side it shows. And then this is the Purple Heart itself, which I'm extremely proud of. I am more proud, I think, probably for the fact of my family. And I think if I had been awarded at the time that I was wounded, it wouldn't have meant near as much to me as it does now, and the fact that my family and my friends were able to help me celebrate this great event.
Yes, that was great. This is unusual to get a Purple Heart after 50 years, and but I saw it on television. You know, I called you. I couldn't be there that day. I had a conflict, an American Legion meeting, and couldn't be there. But I did see it on Channel 6 channels, and it was great.
But in the final review, it said that through error or a grave miscarriage of justice, they wanted to be sure and award me this Purple Heart.
That's great. Well, Charlie, I've certainly enjoyed hearing your story, and I'm sure that your family has heard a lot of it. Maybe they'll hear some things they haven't heard before. And the people of Crawfordsville and Montgomery County will hear your story, and we're just really pleased, and I want to thank you personally for what you did for America.
Well, it was an honor and a privilege